off my property! You're nothing but a gardener!
Maybe. But everything you own grew from the dream you took from me.
She had spent 30 years building a reputation for grace under pressure, for composure that never once cracked in front of investors, reporters, or rivals who wanted nothing more than to see her fail. But on one ordinary evening, in front of 40 of her closest guests, Katherine Beaumont would say 6 words to a quiet old gardener that she could never take back. 6 words that would eventually cost her everything she thought those words were protecting. She had no idea, as she pointed toward her own front gate and told him to get off her property, that the man walking away without a single word in his own defense was holding the one secret that could either save her family's fortune completely or make sure it never survived the year at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The evening had started exactly the way Katherine needed it to start. String lights glowing gold above the back lawn of Rosewood Manor. Champagne flowing freely among investors she'd spent weeks convincing to attend. Laughter drifting across a garden that looked, for one carefully staged night, like nothing at Beaumont Global Trading had ever gone wrong at all. She moved between clusters of guests in a pale blue gown, her smile fixed and practiced, her mind running quiet calculations behind every polite exchange about how many of these people needed to leave tonight, believing her company was still exactly as strong as her husband had left it 3 years earlier. Near the edge of the patio, close enough to the flower beds to keep working quietly through most of the party, an older man named Samuel Whitaker moved between rows of prize orchids with the same unhurried care he brought to every task on these grounds. He wore simple work clothes among a sea of tailored suits and evening gowns, invisible in the way staff are trained to be invisible at events exactly like this one, checking stakes and trellises by lantern light long after most groundskeepers would have already gone home for the evening. Sam had tended Rosewood Manor's gardens for 6 years, and in that time, he had never once attended a party on these grounds as anything other than the man responsible for making sure the flowers looked perfect for everyone else. The wind picked up without warning sometime after 9 o'clock, the kind of sudden gust that rattles glassware and sends napkins skating across tablecloths. And it caught the tall wooden trellis at the center of the orchid display exactly where a bracket had rusted through months earlier, a repair Katherine's household staff had flagged for her attention repeatedly, without ever receiving the funds or the follow-up required to fix it. The trellis buckled first, then gave way completely, sending months of Sam's careful work crashing across the patio in a single collapsing wave of wood and porcelain and torn petals. The sound sharp enough to silence every conversation within 50 feet almost instantly. Every head on that lawn turned at once, and Katherine felt something cold drop through her chest as she watched the exact centerpiece she'd been using all evening to prove her family's continued success collapse in front of the very investors she needed most. Her eyes swept the wreckage for someone to hold responsible, and they landed, almost instinctively, on the only person standing close enough to the ruined display, the quiet older man in work clothes who had spent 6 years keeping these grounds beautiful without a single complaint. She crossed the patio in several sharp strides, her voice rising before she'd fully decided what she intended to say. "You were told about that bracket months ago," Katherine said, her voice carrying easily across a lawn that had gone almost completely silent. Every guest now watching with the particular fascination people reserve for someone else's public unraveling. Sam opened his mouth once, not to argue but simply to explain, and Katherine cut him off before a single word could leave him, her fear and humiliation finding an outlet in the one person present who had no power to defend himself in front of a crowd like this one. "This is exactly the kind of carelessness I cannot afford right now," she continued, her tone sharpening with every syllable. "Do you have any idea what you have just cost me tonight? Sam stood perfectly still through all of it, his hands loosely at his sides, his expression giving away nothing beyond a stillness that read, to anyone paying close enough attention, as something closer to old and practiced patience than simple embarrassment. Katherine, caught between panic and pride in front of 40 watching guests, delivered the final blow before she'd fully considered the weight of it. "You're finished here," she said, loud enough that even the caterers near the kitchen tent turned to look. "Get off my property before I have you removed." The words landed into a silence so complete that even the string lights overhead seemed to dim in sympathy. Sam said nothing in response, not one word of protest, not one attempt to explain that the bracket's failure had never been his fault at all. He simply bent down, gathered the small set of gardening tools he'd been using, and straightened again slowly, the way a man moves when his body carries more years than his posture usually lets on. He looked at Katherine then, just once, and something passed across his face that had nothing to do with anger at all, something closer to recognition, as though he were looking not at the woman shouting at him in that moment, but at someone else entirely, someone from a much older chapter of his life that Katherine knew absolutely nothing about. Then he turned and walked away into the dark, leaving nothing behind but the wreckage of orchids and a silence that would follow Katherine long after her guests had gone home that night. None of the 40 people standing on that lawn, and certainly not Katherine herself, had any idea what she had just done, or who the quiet gardener walking away into the darkness truly was. They didn't know that 30 years earlier, long before Rosewood Manor's gardens ever existed, a young engineer with that same steady, unhurried patience had developed something valuable enough to build an entire fortune on, a fortune that had ended up, through circumstances Katherine had never once questioned, in the hands of her own late husband. They didn't know that the man she'd just humiliated in front of her most important guests held, quietly, and without anyone's knowledge, the single thing that could either rescue her crumbling company completely, or finally collect a debt that had gone unpaid for 3 long decades. 6 months before that windy evening on the lawn, Rosewood Manor had looked, on the surface, exactly like the kind of place where nothing serious could ever go wrong. The estate sprawled across nearly 40 acres at the edge of a quiet American town, its gardens considered among the finest in the region, its main house a wide stone structure that had belonged to the Beaumont family for 2 generations. Katherine had inherited both the house and the company from her husband Richard 3 years earlier, and in the time since his death, she had worked harder than anyone around her fully understood to keep Beaumont Global Trading standing exactly as strong as it had once been under his direct control. Sam Whitaker lived in a modest cottage near the far edge of the estate grounds, a small stone building with a greenhouse behind it that he tended even more carefully than the manicured gardens he was paid to maintain. Inside that greenhouse grew roses unlike anything found anywhere else on the property, a hybrid variety Sam never spoke about to anyone, developed through a careful cross of hardiness and beauty that made them capable of surviving droughts that would have killed almost anything else in that soil. On the windowsill of his small cottage sat a single framed photograph of a woman named Margaret, whom everyone who'd known her simply called Peggy, a photograph Sam touched gently every single morning before beginning his work, a quiet ritual none of the other staff on the estate ever fully understood the weight of. The other groundskeepers respected Sam without quite knowing why, deferring to his opinion on soil composition and plant health in a way that seemed almost instinctive given how little he ever explained about his background. Only one person on the entire estate seemed to understand exactly who Sam truly was, an elderly butler named Bernard Hale, who had served the Beaumont family for over 3 decades and who treated Sam with a quiet, careful respect that bordered on something closer to reverence whenever the 2 men crossed paths on the grounds. Bernard kept an old newspaper clipping folded inside a drawer in his own quarters, yellowed with age, mentioning a promising young engineer named Whitaker whose early work had shown extraordinary commercial potential, a clipping he had never once shown to anyone, including Katherine herself. Katherine's daughter Emma, 26 years old and recently returned home after finishing graduate school, noticed things about Sam that her mother, buried in mounting financial pressure, rarely had time to notice at all. Emma found herself drawn to the greenhouse on quiet afternoons, comforted by Sam's steady presence in a household that felt increasingly brittle the longer her mother struggled beneath a company sliding towards serious trouble. In one of these quiet conversations, Sam let slip, almost without meaning to, that he had once worked with growing things on a scale far larger than a private estate's gardens, before catching himself and changing the subject entirely. Emma didn't press him that afternoon. She simply filed the comment away, sensing, without yet understanding why, that it mattered more than Sam wanted anyone to know. While Sam tended his roses in quiet obscurity, Katherine spent her days 2 floors above an office in the city, watching numbers on quarterly reports that grew more troubling with each passing month since her husband's death. Beaumont Global Trading had built its reputation decades earlier on a foundation Richard always described publicly as pure ambition and instinct, a story Katherine had repeated herself to reporters and investors more times than she could count, without ever once questioning whether it was entirely true. Now, with revenue sliding and a board growing openly restless, that old story wasn't enough to keep the company steady, and Katherine found herself fighting a battle her husband had never fully prepared her to fight alone. A board member named Harold Kessler watched Katherine's mounting struggles with the patient, calculating interest of a man who had wanted control of Beaumont Global Trading for years and had simply been waiting for the right moment to make his move. He said little in public meetings, careful never to appear openly hostile, but he made quiet calls after hours, suggesting gently to other board members that perhaps a grieving widow wasn't the right person to steer a company through the difficult waters ahead. Katherine sensed his maneuvering without being able to prove any of it directly, and the pressure of it left her sharper with everyone around her, snapping at Bernard over small mistakes, dismissing Emma's suggestions in front of guests, growing thinner and more brittle with every week that passed without the deal she desperately needed finally closing. That desperately needed deal involved a company called Ashworth AgriCorp, led by a sharp, no-nonsense executive named Claire Ashworth, whose agricultural division had expressed serious interest in a licensing partnership that could carry Beaumont Global Trading through the next difficult fiscal year and well beyond. Katherine had pursued that partnership for months, certain it represented her clearest path back to stability, unaware that the entire deal hinged on something buried far deeper in her own family's history than she could have possibly imagined. Ashworth's legal team kept circling back to one specific condition neither Katherine nor her own lawyers could immediately explain, a request for exclusive rights to a drought-resistant rose hybrid whose patent, according to public filing records, had been quietly held by a private individual for exactly 30 years. It was the locked drawer in Richard's old study that Katherine walked past nearly every single day without ever once considering opening it, a small detail she rarely thought about at all amid everything else demanding her attention. She told herself, whenever her eyes happened to land on it, that whatever her late husband had kept locked away in there belonged to a part of his life that had nothing to do with the company she was fighting so hard to save. She had no way of knowing, walking past that drawer for the 100th time on an ordinary Tuesday morning, that everything it contained was about to collide directly with a quiet gardener she hadn't yet learned to see as anything more than hired help, a collision that would begin, in earnest, on the night of a garden party still 6 months away. The weeks that followed carried a tension no one at Rosewood Manor could quite name, though everyone on the staff felt it settling deeper into the household with each passing day. Katherine's stalled negotiations with Ashworth AgriCorp had begun to show on her face in ways she hadn't intended anyone to notice, a tightness around her eyes during morning meetings, a shortness in her voice whenever Bernard brought her the day's correspondence. She snapped at a junior assistant over a scheduling error that wasn't the assistant's fault at all, and she canceled 2 of Emma's suggested changes to the upcoming investor party without offering any real explanation beyond simply not now. The household staff had learned, without ever discussing it openly among themselves, to move a little more carefully around her that month. The way people learn to move carefully around whether they can feel changing before it arrives. Sam noticed the shift too, though he said nothing about it to anyone beyond the quiet observation he shared once with Bernard while the two men repaired a section of fence line near the eastern gate. He said only that grief and pressure together could turn even a decent person sharper than they meant to be, a comment Bernard received with a knowing silence that told Sam he understood exactly what kind of household this had become in recent months. Sam kept working his usual hours regardless, tending the orchid displays being prepared for the upcoming party with the same unhurried care he brought to every task, unaware that the trellis holding those very orchids had a rusted bracket flagged for repair on a household maintenance list that never once reached his desk or his attention at all. Emma spent more afternoons in the greenhouse that month than she had in all the months before it combined, drawn there partly by the roses themselves and partly by the steadiness Sam offered in a house that felt increasingly unstable around her. She asked him once, gently, whether he'd ever wanted a life beyond gardening, and Sam paused for a long moment before answering, his hands still moving carefully among the stems in front of him. He told her that he'd once had a very different life, one involving laboratories and patents, and a woman named Peggy who believed in what he was building more than anyone else ever had, before circumstances he preferred not to discuss had led him quietly back to soil and simplicity instead. Emma didn't push further, though the answer stayed with her longer than she expected it to. Claire Ashworth's legal team sent over a revised term sheet 3 weeks before the party, and this time the language around the patent condition had hardened considerably, no longer a preference, but an explicit requirement for the deal to move forward at all. Katherine's own lawyer, a careful man named Julian Ferris who had handled Beaumont Global Trading's affairs since Richard's era, brought the document to her office personally, his expression carrying the particular caution of a man about to deliver news he already suspected she wouldn't like. He explained that the patent in question, registered decades earlier under the initials S. Whitaker, had never once been transferred, licensed, or sold in the 30 years since its original filing, a level of stubborn permanence that made the entire agricultural industry treat it as something close to legend. Katherine asked, somewhat absently at first, whether Ferris had any idea who this Whitaker actually was, expecting the kind of vague corporate answer she usually received about patent holders she'd never have reason to meet personally. Ferris admitted he didn't know, that every attempt to reach the individual through the address on file had gone unanswered for years, and that Ashworth's own team seemed equally unable to locate him despite considerable effort on their end. Katherine set the term sheet aside that afternoon, telling herself she'd return to the problem once the party was behind her, unaware that the answer to a mystery costing her company millions was, at that very moment, kneeling in her own garden 300 yards from her office window, tying back a row of orchid stems for an event he had no idea would end his employment there entirely. Harold Kessler chose that same week to make his first truly aggressive move, calling a smaller, informal gathering of 3 sympathetic board members under the pretense of discussing quarterly logistics. What he actually discussed, carefully and without ever raising his voice, was the growing sense among certain shareholders that Katherine's continued difficulty closing the Ashworth deal suggested a broader inability to steer the company through genuinely difficult decisions. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that perhaps it was time to consider bringing in outside leadership before the situation deteriorated further, planting a seed he fully intended to nurture over the following months regardless of how the party or the Ashworth negotiations ultimately turned out. None of the 3 men in that room said no to him outright, a silence Kessler read, correctly, as quiet permission to continue. The night of the party arrived exactly as these things tend to arrive, with far too much riding on far too fragile a foundation. String lights strung with care across a lawn meant to project stability the household hadn't genuinely felt in over a year. Katherine moved through her guests that evening performing a version of herself she barely recognized in the mirror that morning, gracious and confident on the surface, calculating and afraid underneath it. When the wind rose without warning and the rusted trellis finally gave way beneath months of neglected maintenance, it wasn't simply prize orchids that collapsed across that patio. It was the last thin illusion Katherine had been holding together for her guests, And when it broke in front of 40 watching faces, she reached for the only target close enough to blame, a decision she would spend the rest of this story trying to undo. Sam disappeared from Rosewood Manor the following morning before most of the household staff had even finished cleaning up from the party the night before. His cottage stood empty by the time Bernard walked past it on his usual rounds. Tools returned neatly to the equipment shed, no note left behind, no forwarding address given to the estate office that handled his final pay. Bernard stood in the doorway of that small stone cottage for a long moment, feeling a loss he couldn't quite explain to himself, let alone to anyone else in the household who barely registered Sam's absence beyond noting that someone new would need to be hired for the gardens. Emma noticed immediately, and the unease she'd been carrying about her mother's behavior for weeks sharpened into something closer to genuine alarm. She found Bernard in the estate office later that same day, going through Sam's employment file with an expression she'd never seen on the old butler's face before, something between grief and long-buried frustration. She asked him plainly why he seemed so shaken by the departure of a groundskeeper, and Bernard, after a long pause, told her the truth he'd carried quietly for 6 years without ever being asked directly. Samuel Whitaker wasn't simply a gardener, he explained. He was an engineer once, brilliant enough that her own father had known exactly who he was hiring the day he brought Sam onto these grounds, though Richard had never once mentioned that history to anyone in the family afterward. Emma sat with that revelation in silence, feeling pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed begin, slowly, to align themselves into something far larger than a garden party gone wrong. Katherine, meanwhile, had far less time to dwell on the gardener she'd fired than she expected to have, because the Ashworth deal chose that exact week to reach a breaking point of its own. Claire Ashworth called personally rather than through legal channels, her tone brisk but not unkind, informing Katherine that her team had finally succeeded in locating the elusive patent holder behind the drought-resistant hybrid her company needed, only for that individual to have vanished from his last known residence without any forwarding information whatsoever. Katherine asked, almost reflexively, for the name again, though she'd already been told it twice by her own legal team in recent weeks. Samuel Whitaker, Claire repeated. Katherine felt something cold settle into her stomach even before she consciously understood why the name suddenly sounded so familiar to her. It was Julian Ferris who eventually made the connection explicit, arriving at Katherine's office with the household staff records pulled alongside the patent filing, laying them side by side on her desk with the careful discomfort of a man delivering news that implicated the person paying his salary. The Samuel Whitaker who held the patent Ashworth AgriCorp needed so desperately, and the Samuel Whitaker who had spent 6 quiet years tending Rosewood Manor's gardens before being dismissed publicly at her own party less than a week earlier, were the exact same man. Katherine stared at the documents for a long time without speaking, the full weight of what she'd done settling over her slowly, layer by layer, as she began to understand that the man she'd humiliated in front of 40 investors might have been the only person capable of saving the company those very investors were meant to believe in. Harold Kessler, entirely unaware of this collision unfolding quietly behind Katherine's office door, chose that same week to force the issue he'd been patiently building toward for months. He called for an emergency board session, framing it publicly as a routine check on quarterly performance, though every board member in that room understood the actual purpose the moment Kessler began speaking. He cited the stalled Ashworth deal as clear evidence that Katherine's leadership had grown unsteady since her husband's death, suggesting, in careful, reasonable language, that perhaps it was time to consider bringing in an interim chief executive while the company found its footing again. Katherine sat through the entire meeting with a composure that cost her more than anyone in that room could see, aware now of exactly what she needed to fix, and exactly how little time remained to fix it. She spent 3 days making calls, hiring a discreet investigator to track down Sam's new address, refusing every suggestion from Ferris that she simply send a lawyer in her place to handle the negotiation professionally. She insisted on going herself, though she couldn't fully explain even to herself why the apology felt like it needed to come from her directly rather than through any intermediary at all. When she finally arrived at the small house 2 towns over where Sam now lived, she found a modest garden out front that looked nothing like the manicured grandeur of Rosewood Manor, and yet somehow felt more alive than anything she'd built in her own backyard. Roses climbing along a simple wooden fence with a vibrancy that stopped her for a moment before she even reached the front door. Sam answered without visible surprise, as though some part of him had been expecting this visit since the morning he'd packed his tools and walked away without a word. He invited her in with the same quiet courtesy he'd shown for 6 years on her own property, offering her tea she didn't accept, listening without interruption as she explained, haltingly at first, and then more plainly, exactly why she'd come. She asked him to license the patent, to save the company her husband had built, offering terms generous enough that most people in his position would have accepted without hesitation. Sam listened to the entire proposal in silence, and when she finished, he told her something that stopped her completely. He'd held that patent for 30 years and never once sold it. He said, not because the money didn't matter, but because of exactly what it would mean to hand over the one thing he'd built with his own hands to a Beaumont a second time. Katherine sat with that phrase for a long moment, turning it over without understanding it, and asked him plainly what he meant by a second time. Sam studied her face carefully before answering, seeming to search for some sign that she already knew the history he was about to reveal, and finding only genuine confusion staring back at him instead. He told her, gently but without softening the truth, that 30 years earlier, her husband Richard had bought this exact hybrid from him under circumstances Sam still considered one of the great betrayals of his professional life. A deal struck while Sam was young, unconnected, and desperate enough to accept terms far below what the invention was actually worth. He said nothing further that afternoon beyond suggesting, quietly, that she go home and look into her husband's early business records herself rather than take an old gardener's word for any of it. Katherine drove home in a silence that lasted the entire 2 hours back to Rosewood Manor, Sam's words circling in her mind alongside a memory she'd never once examined closely, the locked drawer in Richard's old study that she'd walked past 1,000 times without curiosity. She went there directly upon arriving home, ignoring Bernard's questioning glance in the hallway, and forced the old lock open with a letter opener from Richard's desk rather than waiting to locate the proper key. Inside, she found decades-old correspondence, patent applications bearing Sam's name and signature, and a buyout agreement dated 30 years earlier that made her stomach turn the longer she read it. Terms so lopsided in Richard's favor that she found it difficult to imagine any lawyer had allowed a client to sign them willingly. Buried further beneath those documents, Katherine found something that turned her stomach in an entirely different way. A private letter written by Sam years after the original buyout, addressed directly to Richard, describing in careful, restrained language exactly what that deal had cost him. His standing in the engineering industry, ruined by whispers that he'd sold cheap and easy rather than fought to keep what was his. His ability to raise capital for any future work, gone the moment word spread of how the deal had unfolded. And most painfully, medical bills for a wife named Peggy that had piled up faster than Sam could manage alone in the years after the sale. Money that should rightfully have been his sitting instead inside the foundation of the very company Katherine now desperately needed to save. Richard had never once answered that letter. He'd simply kept it, filed away with the rest, as though owning the proof of what he'd done was its own quiet form of victory. Katherine sat alone in that darkened study long past midnight, the weight of 30 years settling over her in a single sleepless night. understanding now exactly why Sam had taken a groundskeeper's position on the very estate his stolen invention had helped build, and exactly why Bernard's loyalty toward him had always carried something closer to reverence than ordinary staff courtesy. She understood, finally, why the man she'd humiliated in front of 40 guests had said nothing in his own defense that night. Why he'd simply looked at her once with something like recognition before walking away into the dark. He hadn't been protecting a job that meant little to him. He'd been carrying 30 years of restraint that her own cruelty had finally tested to its absolute limit. Restraint she now understood he'd maintained not out of weakness, but out of a discipline she was only beginning to comprehend. She returned to Sam's small house 2 days later, this time without any proposal prepared in advance, without lawyers or term sheets or anything beyond the plain truth of what she'd found in her husband's study. She told him everything: the buyout agreement, the letter about Peggy's medical bills, Richard's silence in the face of a debt he'd clearly understood himself to owe. She offered no excuses for her late husband and none for her own behavior at the party either, telling Sam plainly that whatever he decided about the patent, she intended to make the theft right regardless, even if doing so cost her the company Kessler was already circling to take from her hands. Sam listened to all of it with the same careful stillness he brought to everything, and when she finished, something in his expression shifted, softened, the way ground softens after a long and necessary rain. He told her, after a long silence, that he was willing to license the hybrid, though not on the exclusive terms Ashworth AgriCorp had originally requested. He wanted public credit as the invention's original creator, something he'd been denied for 30 years, and he wanted the back royalties owed to him restructured not as a lump settlement, but as a genuine equity stake in Beaumont Global Trading itself, a stake that would make him, quietly, and for the first time in his life, a true partner in the very company built partly on his work. Katherine agreed without hesitation, understanding that this arrangement cost her more in control than any of Kessler's proposed alternatives ever would, and caring, for once, less about control than about finally getting something right that had been wrong for 30 years. She brought the restructured deal to her board herself rather than letting Ferris present it on her behalf, standing in front of the same room where Kessler had spent months quietly suggesting she was no longer fit to lead. She told them everything, not carefully edited for comfort, but plainly, admitting her husband's original theft rather than concealing it, explaining the humiliation she'd caused Sam at her own party and the debt that humiliation had ultimately helped her uncover. The room sat in uncomfortable silence through most of her account, several board members shifting visibly at the admission of Richard's early misconduct, though what followed surprised even Katherine herself. Rather than eroding their confidence in her, the honesty of the account began, slowly, to shift the room's posture toward her instead of away. Emma, who had pieced together Sam's history before her mother ever fully understood it, spoke up in that meeting for the first time in her young career, telling the board plainly that a company built honestly from this point forward was worth infinitely more than one that continued hiding what it had been built on originally. Her voice carried a conviction that surprised even Bernard, who stood quietly near the back of the room, watching the Beaumont family's next generation defend a truth he himself had guarded silently for 30 years. Kessler attempted one final objection, insisting the entire disclosure represented exactly the kind of instability he'd been warning the board about for months. But the room had already begun to turn, and his objection landed into a silence that told him, clearly, his moment had passed. The board voted that same afternoon to support Katherine's restructured leadership and the new equity arrangement with Sam, effectively ending Kessler's months of careful maneuvering in a single meeting he hadn't seen coming. He resigned from the board within the following weeks, understanding that whatever influence he'd once held had evaporated the moment Katherine chose honesty over the image he'd been counting on her to protect at any cost. Beaumont Global Trading stock, which had been sliding steadily for over a year, began to stabilize almost immediately. Investors responding not to the financial terms of the Ashworth deal itself, but to the rare sight of a company willing to correct a decades-old wrong in full public view rather than quietly burying it the way most companies would have chosen to do instead. Rosewood Manor's gardens were rebuilt entirely the following spring, the damaged trellis and its rusted bracket replaced with a design far sturdier than anything that had stood there before, and at its center, a new bed of roses unlike any Katherine had ever displayed on her property. The exact hybrid Sam had developed 30 years earlier, labeled now with a small plaque bearing his full name and the true story of its origin. Sam returned to Rosewood Manor not as a groundskeeper this time, but as a partner and consultant on the agricultural licensing arrangement that now bore his name publicly for the first time in 3 decades, though he insisted, gently and without negotiation, on keeping his hands in the soil regardless of whatever title the paperwork now attached to him. On a quiet evening not long after the new gardens were finished, Katherine found Sam exactly where she'd first grown accustomed to finding him years earlier, kneeling among the roses in the late afternoon light, tending stems with the same unhurried care he'd always brought to that work. She thanked him, not for the patent, not for the equity arrangement that had ultimately helped save her company, but for something she considered far more significant than either. She thanked him for not allowing 30 years of justified bitterness to curdle into the same cruelty that had once been done to him. Sam looked toward the small framed photograph he now kept on a shelf inside the greenhouse. The same picture of Peggy that had traveled with him from cottage to cottage all these years, and then back at Katherine, offering her the kind of quiet smile that carried more forgiveness in it than either of them had expected this story to end with. Some things, he told her, are worth more once they're finally allowed to grow out in the open rather than kept hidden away in the dark. Katherine stood beside him among the roses as the sun began its slow descent behind Rosewood Manor's stone walls, the two of them saying little else that evening, because between them, after everything the past 6 months had uncovered, very little else truly needed to be said. The gardens Sam had once tended in quiet obscurity now bloomed under his own name for the first time in 30 years, and the company his stolen invention had helped build all those decades ago finally stood, however imperfectly, on ground that was honest at last.